We all have a dark side, but what happens when it's not just ours? This is the second video in a series on Truths for Hard Times, and I want to talk a little bit about one of the big limitations of doing what Carl Jung would have called shadow work, or actually the people who came after called shadow work. And it means becoming conscious of and taking responsibility for our dark side, because we all have one, as Jung and Freud and many others have pointed out. So when we look around the world and we see greed and narcissism and maliciousness and vengefulness and envy and petty retribution, or even big retribution, there are echoes of that in all of us, at least as potentials. So the idea coming out of this, which I don't think is actually Jung, it's how he's interpreted, is that if you and I as individuals clean up our shadow, if we take those sides, those dark sides of us into account, instead of projecting them out onto other people, what a bright world we will live in. Unfortunately, things are a lot more complex than that, which is why Jung wrote about the collective shadow. That the shadow isn't just our own dark side, that groups have shadows, that whole countries have shadows. And sometimes that shadowy stuff that's outside of us, we don't primarily contribute to it except in small ways, but it can really hammer us. So that's what I wanted to focus on, because it's important to know how to deal with that. So let me use just a small example of my own process about this that comes out of my writing. So I've been working for some years on creating stories and novels for my Assembling Terrania cycle, which starts taking place about 60, 70 years from now. So speculative fiction and science fiction in particular, although there are elements of fantasy and magical realism as well. And I'm curious about how human beings will step up to things like climate chaos and political authoritarianism and stuff like that, religious authoritarianism too. Curious about how that's going to go over the next decades. So I write about it, and the center of my curiosity is not heroes, but people who are caught up in things that are bigger than them and how they will deal with that, how they will rise above themselves and become better people as they deal with it. So there's also some who become worse people. And I wrote about one of them, his name was Peter, in Peter Circa, in my second novel, which was Heartlander. But I'm working on the 7th book now, which is a collection of stories. And this villain popped up in my imagination pretty recently, and he's going to be a real piece of work. So the usual way of understanding this is, well, all of an author's characters are parts of him, right? And there's truth in that. If I had no experience with that kind of evil, it would be hard to write about. But let's not underestimate the imagination, by the way. So when people say write what you know, that might apply to nonfiction, but Ursula K. Le Guin, somebody like her, would say write what you don't know. Bring fantasy into it, bring imagination in. So I got to wondering about this character, and I can identify a few things about him that I've had struggles with in the past in more minor ways. But I think he's actually more a reflection of the collective shadow. And here, as we head toward the end of 2025, I live in a country that's ruled by some of the most intensely evil people you could come up with anywhere. Really, really evil people who have fooled millions. Mainly by accusing others of what they themselves are guilty of. So we run into the collective shadow all the time, and the mistake we make is to think that it's mainly personal. So when you're up against collective evil, it can be numbing, it can be toxic. Some of us have to limit the amount of news we see or the amount of social media we're exposed to, because there's so much darkness, there's so much shadow that it just starts tearing you down. So on the one hand, we want to avoid that, but on the other hand, we want to be aware of it, because being aware of it is the only way to realize Some of this is me and some of this is absolutely not me, instead of taking it all on. So Rollo May, the psychologist, once said that the ultimate mistake is the refusal to look evil in the face. And it's important to realize in this context that he didn't mean just our own evil, which of course it's important to recognize and to look at and to try to do something about. One of the definitions of a mature, psychologically mature adult, an emotionally mature adult, is the capacity to look at yourself and say, there's stuff wrong here. There are things wrong here that I need to repair or fix or heal from. So we absolutely need that. But it's possible to go too far down that road and start making ourselves responsible for what's actually happening outside of us, committed by intensely evil people who project their shadow all over everything and everyone. So a step in understanding that is the ability to step back and say, you know what, there are things in me that resonate here and there with what's happening, but some of that stuff is outside me and it needs to stay out.